up new fiscal ambitions. Closing out the fiscal year. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds, a 30-minute conversation with leaders of mission-based organizations. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the excitement of closing out the fiscal year and setting up ambitions for anew.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. This week's episode is pretty interesting because planning our fiscal year end tends to be a very stressful time. Not only are we wrapping up our staffing needs, but we're also planning for the future and resetting the clock on our ambitions and development activities. I want to welcome my two colleagues, Cynthia Rojas and Peta Blakely, to the show. And if you're just joining us today, pop your name in the chat and let us know where you're from. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Really good.
I thought I'd switch up the introduction this morning.
I loved it.
You know, let everyone know that we're not always doing the same thing.
Right.
But I'm pretty excited for today's show. I mean, we're taking a stressful situation for many, right? Closing the fiscal year, making everything balanced. And we're turning into some positive ambitions, really to give people some definitely interesting key takeaways today, I would say.
You know, and this has been, for me in my business, I'm in the middle of the fiscal year. A lot of organizations have just ended a fiscal year. This has really been like quite a year, right? You know, there's a lot going on. And I'm feeling a little bit like we're just drained coming to the end of this year or this quarter.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of leaders who are exhausted. And for many nonprofit organizations, the pandemic we're still in the middle of a crisis. They're still serving individuals who have needs, and the increase in needs for many industries have not subsided. Mm-hmm. So we have to remember that there are nonprofits who are still working through a crisis.
Yeah, this is a good segue. This is a good segue, Peta. We've spoken a lot about evaluations on our show and performance measures over the course of time. If you could pick two of those indicators to help close out the fiscal year, what might those indicators be?
Well, you know, this was the year of staff engagement, right? And I would say that would probably be the number one indicator or item to measure right now. Are they okay? Are they okay to be doing this work? Are they engaged with your organization? Do they feel like they've been taken care of? We tend to think of COVID as being one big shock. It's been continuous shocks for the last 2 years, right? And constant changes and transitions. We went home, we went back to the office. In some cases, we went home again. And all of this is incredibly stressful for people. So I would say that's the number one thing, like, is your organization okay at the personal level? And then from there, I would look at, and are we doing what we set out to do, which is probably different right now than it's been in previous years, right? If you have been adapting and being nimble in the last couple of years, now's probably the time to do a little bit of catch up in terms of how do we evaluate that? And how do we create measures of, did we really show up for the community that we're committed to showing up for in the appropriate ways? And did we do it as well as we could with quality and integrity right now? You know, so those are the things that I would be looking at, and I'd really be trying to engage a lot of stakeholders in those conversations.
Oh, you're muted, Rebecca.
Sorry, I was moving my paper, so I just muted. I was just saying we're working currently on a project for stakeholder engagement to leverage some new opportunities based on the evaluation data that we have captured for the end of the year. It's really, I would love to do another segment on stakeholder engagement and continue this fiscal year end, because it only sets you up for success if you take exactly what you're talking about, Peta, and turn it into the positive and set up these new ambitions. So I can see us doing a few more discussions on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And both of those topics require adapting our funding, right? So now's a really good time to be looking at what is our development plan for the coming year.
Right, because it resets the clock. This is, the fiscal year end stressors, at least in the financial and development, fund development sector, is really, okay, well, now we've spent all the funds that we needed to spend out the grants, and, where are we going to get the next set of funds? Hopefully, organizations were looking towards the future and not in the moment for funding. And, it's a nice reminder not to go back to the same pool for resources, but to diversify your pool of funding and diversify your development efforts. It's an opportunity and not necessarily a what do we do now? Which is a little
Yeah, and I don't want to mock organizations that are feeling like, what do we do now? It's hard to get ahead, right?
It is.
Like we've talked so much about, like, creating that discipline about thinking a couple of years ahead and doing more long-term development. But that is the vision.
Absolutely. And using the data to guide you. It's interesting how much data we put in the file cabinet. And, so Cynthia, when you think about translating the data and having these tough conversations and setting up these ambitions, what is some guidance that you have for leaders to help them along the way? Because these are tough conversations.
They are. And I do want to answer the question you asked, Peta, because and then I can answer yours because I think it all relates. But we are 28 months into the pandemic. And if your organization has not had the time to review its policies, to set new policies, to begin to build the infrastructure that it needs to support the way you're working, this is the year to do it. Because this is the pandemic, and working under these circumstances have become a way of working. And so if you're still trying to figure some things out, remember what Peter said about the human element, and that constantly being changing and not being stable can impact your staff. So you want to begin to think about that if you have not. Many organizations have. The second thing I think that organizations could begin to think about, if they have not, is doing a competitor analysis. And the reason why I say that is, one, nonprofits don't think they have competitors, some nonprofits, and you do. And two, other organizations have changed and transformed. So even if you knew who your competitors were pre-COVID, you might want to do a reassessment just so that you can remain on the cutting edge. So those are the two things I would have added. Now, to answer your question specifically, which I've already forgotten how to have hard conversations about the data that you're receiving. My hope is that you create a culture where those conversations happen all the time. And if they don't, so let's say you're going to start having these conversations, as a leader, I would recommend you first hold individual conversations of the people who are going to be at the table, so that no one's caught by surprise and no one's having to defend themselves, but that they know what to expect going into that meeting.
Yeah, and creating a culture about how we talk about metrics is so important, right? That these are tools to help us get better.
In addition to the internal discussions of really just the wrap up of the fiscal year, this is also a time where we have to be reporting out all of the information that happened for the year. And many a times organizations don't have annual reports. So all of these conversations that you're suggesting, Cynthia, and all of the advice that you're lending, PETA, I think is a nice way to put together an annual report, but also one that looks different than others. And that's what's going to be the draw for funders. They have done a lot of work changing and modifying their procedures, their processes for requesting funds and managing funds over, what did you say, 28 months, Cynthia?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be sticking out now, right? Like stick out like a sore thumb. My mother always told me, don't do that. You're going to stick out like a sore thumb, but you want to stick out like a sore thumb.
You actually want to stand out now.
Sorry, Mom.
And the reasons that they're doing that, I think, are so compelling and great, right? I mean, funders, said at the beginning of COVID, they said, we're really not sure what to do here either. We're going to trust the organizations that are closest to the work. So there were a lot less requirements or I don't want to say there were less requirements. They were less rigid. They were a lot more willing to be a lot more flexible with organizations being creative in how they used funds. And funders are also thinking about some of the ways they've collected data in the past have actually perpetuated and replicated racism and inequality.
Mm-hmm.
So they're trying to reinvent, how do we collect the information that the organizations and that the communities want to give us, right? And do something that is rigorous and helpful and helps us make good decisions without replicating some of the bad habits we have from the past. It's really an exciting time and an opportunity for organizations to contribute to that conversation with how they're presenting and sharing their information.
And education, because a lot of organizations, they just collect the data that their predecessor or whomever has collected. Right. And so they're just doing what has historically been done. And now's the time to say, it's really important that we look beyond just, what is your income? Okay, do you fall below the federal poverty line? Do you qualify for this service or not? Oh, you're on the cusp. I'm sorry, you don't qualify. You're not able to be served here. That happens a lot. Well, what about other indicators in someone's circumstance other than income? We need to look at things other than income, because it could just be underemployment or temporary unemployment that impacted their income. So I really like how we're talking about the whole person, the whole family development in raising development and opportunities and ambitions for nonprofits going forward to attract funders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Another thing that I'm seeing when I talk to leaders is real exhaustion, and coupled with their leaders who have not taken any time off. Mm. I anticipate, and Rebecca, I'm going to look to you to see if this is a valid point. I anticipate this year is going to be challenging because a lot of the stimulus funding is going away or won't be existing this year, at least to the degree that we had it 2 years ago. Foundations that set out to focus their money in very specific areas to get organizations through the pandemic might go back to their original or core funding categories. And so I think from a funding perspective, it may be very stressful. The reason why I'm coupling this with time off is because the leaders should take a significant amount of time off, as much as they can, and reset themselves. Because I think this is going to be a tough year. What do you think, Rebecca?
That's an interesting question. I've actually been asked this a lot, and we've had conversations, because remember, we focus on building a sustainable practice. And in order to do that, you have to look to the future of funding, which you can't predict, but you can create strategies to help you be more successful in doing so. And one of the things that I will say is that funding is based with private foundation on the previous year's economic performance. So however this year and fiscally is what we are going to see with giving in the coming years. In 2008, I believe it was, when we had the last disruption economically, we saw organizations who are not prepared for that. I mean, no one was really prepared for that. But I would take lessons from that experience, and I would couple them with what we've gone through over the last 28 months and in preparation for the coming year. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you it's going to be a lot more competitive, a lot more disruptive, and difficult to secure funding. So if you can start proactively now, you're going to be setting yourself up for success, or at least eliminate any potential struggle that you may see or foresee coming.
That's great advice. That is
So
great.
what should organizations be doing right now as they're setting their plan, setting their fundraising and development goals for the year?
Sure, that's a great question, Peta. What we could be doing is, so funding first and foremost is never ours, right? It is an investment from a funder into our organization to make the impact that we anticipate measuring as a result of that grant. And so we have to first recognize that if a funder funded us for a year, 3 years, even 20 years, right? Because there are organizations who've received the same funding for a long period of time. It isn't ours. And so creating that detachment from that, I don't want to use the word entitlement. I don't really care for that word, but creating that detachment is the first step. And looking to see, okay, well, if this fund ended tomorrow, what would we do? Are we prepared? Do we have a diverse portfolio of direct donation, of legacy giving, of grants and fundraising? I, believe it or not, my entire business is built around grant right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't usually go higher than a quarter of 25% of our entire development portfolio in grant funding, because it's not sustainable. And I know people can't believe that, but it's the truth, and so if you can really break out your organization into the different areas of development and try to amplify the direct give, you're going to be more sustainable than just relying on grant funding alone.
Wow. I mean, that's a very different way to think, I think, than a lot of organizations. Yeah.
It is. And,
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting don't go for grants. I'm just suggesting that, let's think about this. We submit a grant today, right? It might take 30, 60, 90 days to get that award. So that brings us into almost November before the program starts. If we need, let's say, $400,000 before December, and we're just getting it in November, what are we doing in the meantime? We need to be raising funds, talking about legacy giving, direct donation in the meantime, to support the organization, because that's where you see the staff layoffs. That's where you see, we're cutting supplies, to be able to avoid those things is really important, because that also is what keeps your morale going of your organization, right? You're healthier that way. And I'm not suggesting grants are not the way to go, but if you can amplify your resources from other areas, grants should be complementary to that and not the be all end all.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And so what I'm hearing, or the way I'm interpreting what you're saying, is that we need to take a real business approach to the future. And there are many nonprofits, and I want to acknowledge them, that do look at the operating of a nonprofit as if it's a business, as if it's a for-profit business. And so that's important. But what you're also encouraging is that if we're not thinking like that, the strategic planning, the strategic thinking about diversifying your income and revenue, and thinking about your operations and thinking about your infrastructure. And if you have undergone growth, then that's another thing that gets layered on top of all of this. So this is what I hear from you, Rebecca, is if you're not running the nonprofit as you would a business, meaning looking at your financials, diversifying revenue, looking at operations, this is probably the year to do that, because the competition is rising.
It's very interesting that you have that perspective. Yes, it is, in layman's terms, yes, it is true, right? But that's why we rely on the expertise of a CFO, of a financial assistant, of a program director, program officers. All of the team members within our organization should be contributing their skills in their roles to the overall development of our organization. And when it when an organization does that, creates that culture, that's when you see an organization thrive. And if you were to look at it from the for-profit sector, then yes, it appears as though that nonprofit is operating like a well-oiled business machine. Now that's where you're going to get some of that pushback, where we hear about hierarchy and inequity in organizational structure. We're looking at it more of a financial, a development, a what are everyone's roles and how do they contribute to the overall goals of the organization. And that's where you get away from the discussions of inequity, because everyone's talents and skills are maximized in the lane they're in. But also, organizations are creating a culture for others to say, well, I have an interest in this other area of our organization. I wonder if I can receive some mentoring in that area, or I can lend some of my expertise outside my lane into other areas.
Yeah.
That's a well-oiled organization.
I love that. I love that.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're both saying be more ambitious this year, right? Be more ambitious in how you're structuring your organization. I mean, I feel like a lot of organizations are probably on their back foot right now, right? Thinking, no, now isn't the time to professionalize, to grow, to fundraise more, to rewrite our job descriptions. But that seems like what you're recommending is go big.
Absolutely. Go ambitious, go big. Now's the time, because think of how much stress everyone was under when the pandemic hit and these last 28 months. Do we want to stay stagnant like this, or do we want to get out of this and say, you know what, we're going to do things different, because people's needs have changed. Communities have completely changed. There's so much migration in the country right now. There's so much change going on right now. And I think it's a very exciting time. We should be taking advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
I love your enthusiasm. And I think it's important, again, for leaders who are exhausted, who haven't taken time off, take your time off so that you can refresh, because this is going to be your year. There are many organizations that have grown as a result of the pandemic, and many of us figured it out as we were going along. 28 months in, we have to make it part of operations. And so this is your year.
Yep.
And reaching out to funders, right? I mean, I think, Peter, you had talked about this in an episode a few weeks ago, is pick up the phone now and introduce yourself to funders. Go where the funders are circulating, Don't just send them a newsletter, invite them to your ball. Those days are over. I'm sorry, they are over, right? We need to be speaking with people from a humanitarian perspective, right? That people's lives are actually at stake. We've learned that over 28 months. It isn't just, oh, that would be a great grant to get, we should try for it. Those days are over. I'm not trying to be gloom and doom. I'm saying, okay, well, what can we do that's new and ambitious, that's going to set ourselves up for success?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're 100% right. One of the things that we've learned over the last couple of years is, everything is on the table.
Mm-hmm.
The way you have done business, the way we've done school, jobs, where we live, people are rethinking everything. So now's the time to do something completely different from whatever you were doing before. Yeah. So Rebecca, in our last few minutes, like what advice do you give somebody who is sitting down right now to make next year's financial plan? What do they need to prioritize, or what should they be doing right now?
Well, I can tell you what I do in the work, because I do the work, and it might be helpful. When I feel overwhelmed, I prioritize what needs to be done now, today, this week, this month. And I lay out my projects so that I'm not sitting in a pile. I look at it like a pile of dirty laundry, right? How am I ever going to get this washed and dried and folded? It's not going to happen, and looking to others to help you where you either don't have the information or the knowledge or the time. right? Time is a huge factor here. And not putting so much pressure on yourself to deliver everything perfectly. Leaning into others is a great way to expand your network. I think the more you take the time to map out what you're doing, grab a planner, pen and paper. I have 3 planners and 3 calendars on paper. I love to write. I love to write notes. And just keeping yourself focused, organized, and figuring out what that direction forward is and engaging your team members with you instead of calling them frantically when, oh my gosh, this is due, that's due, I'm swimming in the pile of laundry.
Yeah, right.
You can't function well in a crisis if
Right.
your crisis is unbeknownst to you self-created crises, right?
Yeah, right. And we've been navigating crises constantly for
Yes.
over 2 years. I think we're kind of crisis numb at this point.
We're crisis what?
Crisis numb.
I'm
Yeah.
throwing in the glossary. I'm putting it in the comments.
Just nobody has time for that. Nobody has time for you to act like this is an emergency just because you didn't get to it, right?
Yeah.
That's great.
We've been using the word adaptation for 2 years, and if there's anything that has changed is organizations found themselves needing to be adaptive. And the truth of the matter is it's if you embed that in your culture and that's your way of thinking, then you're better apt to deal with some of the things that you're gonna face in the future. And so think about how adaptive you became and how do you sustain that so that your staff are not exhausted but actually inspired by the change.
Right.
And using the data to create those adaptations, to create the change, really sitting, making time, look at your data, look at your feedback from your community. What are people asking you for? They have ambitions for the community in which they live and we work and we play.
Yep.
Why aren't we listening to the people in the community? You can work in the community and still be a part of that community. Those are the ambitions. Those are the fiscal ambitions, the development ambitions that we need to be focusing on. And when a funder sees that that's the approach that we're taking, they're more inclined to fund us when everyone else's application says the same thing, is doing the same thing, the same activities. We want to be new, unique, and different. And that's what the ambition going forward is going to be.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I think what a great moment, for people to stop and reflect on the last year or so and be much, and it's a great invitation to be open-minded about planning for the future. And
if you want to come on the show and talk about it, come on.
That would be great.
Looking for guests for our show.
And that's awesome because I always want to hear about people who are doing it well because I want a model that I can follow, right? And we tend to lean toward when people aren't doing it well, but I always want to know, well, who's doing it well and can I meet them? So yes, if you're doing it well, please contact us so that you could come on the show. But one of the things that strikes me about this conversation is that nothing that we said is new, right? And so what it is about going back to basics, right? Everything we learned when we first became an executive director or a leader, and also hitting the reset button, right? And thinking about, okay, when we were first starting to build, what was that like? And I'm talking about, that could have been 20 years ago. And a lot of those rules still apply. Bring people to the table, do your strategic planning, do some mind mapping, everything we're saying. And so the hope is that leaders are used to this or have done it, and that is not foreign, but rather inspiring.
That's a great way to close out the show. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time. on Coffee Time with Masterminds. Have a great
Have a
weekend.
great weekend, everybody.
Bye, everyone.